The valley had a way of testing people quietly, not with storms or floods, but with the slow, grinding weight of other people's certainty about who you were and what you deserved. She had arrived in that valley 18 months ago as a bride, carried west by a marriage contract that read more like a property deed than a promise. The rancher who met her at the depot had been tall, reserved, and visibly disappointed that she had brought a spotted goat in a wooden crate alongside her single traveling trunk. He had said nothing about the goat directly. He had simply looked at it, then at her, then turned and walked toward his buckboard with the particular silence of a man who had already decided he was owed something better. She had loaded the crate herself. The ranch was the largest in the valley, 3,000 acres of Montana grassland pressing against the base of a granite ridge that turned violet at sundown. The hands knew every fence post and water line. They knew which horses bit and which cattle drifted. What they did not know, and were not especially interested in learning, was anything about her. She was the boss's wife. She kept the house. She was decorative, presumably, and perhaps useful in the ordinary domestic ways. Beyond that, the general assessment of the valley, expressed in the careful silences of Sunday services and the pointed pleasantries of the general store, was that she was an unusual woman, and unusual was not, in that particular corner of Montana, considered a compliment. The goat, especially, attracted commentary. It was a small thing, spotted brown and white, with amber eyes that regarded the world with an unsettling intelligence. She kept it in a separate pen, fed it carefully, and milked it every morning before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. The milk she stored in a large glass jar she had brought from the east, sealed with waxed cloth, and kept in the coolest corner of the root cellar. Her husband had never asked about it. She had never explained. Theirs was not yet a marriage of explanations. They had reached a kind of working arrangement over the 18 months. Respectful, careful, neither warm nor cold. He ran the ranch. She ran the house. They shared meals in a polite and particular silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite unhappy. She had learned his patterns. He had, she suspected, learned almost nothing about hers. That was about to change. It began on a Tuesday morning in the last week of August, when the heat pressed down on the valley like a flat iron and the air tasted of dry grass and distant thunder. She was at the kitchen table reviewing the household ledger, a task he had never assigned her and never forbidden her, which she had quietly taken on herself, when she heard the sound from the yard. Not a shout, not a crash, just a single, heavy sound, like something large and certain had decided without warning to fall. She was already moving before she reached the window. She found him face down in the dirt between the water trough and the porch steps. Not crumpled, not twisted, fallen the way a tall man falls when his body simply quits negotiating. Flat and still and frighteningly quiet. She did not scream. She knelt beside him, pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck, and felt his pulse. Rapid, shallow, wrong in a way she recognized the way a seamstress recognizes a crooked seam. Not the pulse of a man who had fainted from the heat. Something deeper was pulling at him. The ranch hands materialized from various corners of the property in the way men do when something has gone wrong. Cautious, hovering, not quite willing to be the first to speak. 3 of them stood at a respectful distance, hats in hand, watching her work. She did not ask for their opinions. She directed them clearly and without drama. 2 to carry him inside, 1 to ride to town for the doctor. She held the door open herself. She pulled back the bedding herself. She had a wet cloth on his forehead before the men had finished straightening the room with their uncomfortable, unhelpful presence. His fever was already climbing. She knew this fever, not this exact fever, not this man, not this particular August afternoon. But she had seen its shape before, back east, in the cramped summer rooms of her aunt's boarding house, where the heat and the crowding did terrible work on a body's defenses. She knew what it looked like when a fever settled into the bones rather than the skin. She knew it did not always respond to the powders and tinctures the doctor would bring. She began preparing anyway. Cool water, clean cloth, a light broth set to simmer on the back of the stove. She moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, and the ranch hands, one by one, found reasons to go back to work. The doctor arrived before noon. He was a compact, self-assured man with a leather bag and the particular confidence of someone who had never seriously considered being wrong. He examined the patient with brisk authority, announced it was a fever of the blood likely brought on by the heat and overwork, dispensed a brown paper packet of powder to be dissolved in water, and delivered a brief lecture on the importance of rest and hydration. She listened. She thanked him. She did not argue. She also, in the privacy of her own thoughts, did not entirely believe him. The powder was for the surface of a thing. What she was watching in her husband's face, the faint gray beneath the tan, the way his breathing had already taken on a slightly labored quality, suggested the fever intended to go much further before it considered turning back. She walked the doctor to the door. He paused on the porch, squinting out at the yard with the comfortable ease of a man who expected to be obeyed. "Keep him still," he said, "and don't let anyone fill his head with home remedies. This calls for proper medicine." She smiled. "Of course," she said. She was already thinking about the root cellar. The root cellar was cool and dark and smelled of earth and dried herbs and the particular quiet that comes from things that have been waiting patiently to be useful. She had organized it herself in the weeks after her arrival, when the house was still strange to her and the land still learning her name. She knew where everything was. She moved through the dimness with the calm efficiency of a woman who understood that emergencies did not wait for good lighting. What she was looking for was not a powder or a tincture. It was simpler than that, and older, and the doctor would have dismissed it with a single raised eyebrow had she been foolish enough to mention it in his presence. Fresh milk, but not from the dairy cow, from the spotted goat. She had brought the animal with her from back east, tucked into the livestock car along with a small cedar trunk, and considerably more gossip from the neighboring passengers. The ranch hands had found the goat immediately amusing. She was small and obstinate and had opinions about everything. Her spots were irregular and her gaze was frankly judgmental. She was not the kind of animal one associated with serious ranching, and the men had made that observation loudly and often in the early weeks, never quite managing to say it directly to their employer's wife, but never quite managing to say it out of her hearing either. She had let it go. A woman who fought every small battle, exhausted herself before the large ones arrived. But she had kept the goat. And she had kept feeding her the particular mixture of dried herbs and good hay and fresh water that she had learned from her grandmother, a woman who had known things about sickness and recovery that no medical college had yet thought to write down. The goat's milk was rich and clean and carried a quality she had no scientific name for, only practical evidence. She had seen it work on fevers before, not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily, the way a quiet river eventually moves a stone. She filled a large glass jar from the morning's yield, still cool from the cellar shelf, and held it up briefly against the thin light coming through the doorway. Clear. Good. She carried it back to the house with both hands. At the bedroom door, she paused. Through the wood, she could hear his breathing, slower than it should have been, but present. She had learned, in the short time of their marriage, to read the particular grammar of his silences. This one said he was still fighting. That was enough. She pushed the door open with her shoulder. He was awake. Not alert, but awake. Eyes half open, tracking her movement across the room with the slow, deliberate focus of a man conserving every available resource for the task of remaining conscious. His gaze settled on the jar. "What is that?" he said. His voice was rough and thin. "Something that will help," she said. He considered this for a moment. Outside, she could hear boots crossing the yard. The boots on the yard were not one set, but several. Unhurried, deliberate. The way men walk when they are certain they are about to witness something worth watching. She did not look toward the window. She kept her attention on her husband, on the jar in her hands, on the simple arithmetic of what needed to happen next. She poured a measure into the tin cup from the bedside table, steady and careful, not spilling a drop. "I know what it looks like," she said quietly, settling onto the edge of the bed. "I know what you're thinking." "I'm not thinking much of anything," he admitted. "Too tired for it." "Then that's in my favor." She offered him the cup. "Drink it slowly. Don't rush it." He looked at the milk. His expression carried the particular weariness of a man who has spent 3 days refusing to die and is running low on the energy required even for skepticism. He took the cup from her hand. His fingers were hot against hers, dry, the skin tight with fever, and she made herself stay still rather than pull back from the heat of it. He drank. Slow, as she had asked. She watched his throat move. He lowered the cup and looked at her with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite bewilderment, but something quietly between them. The expression of a man recalibrating an assumption he had held without examining it. The door to the bedroom opened without a knock. The doctor filled the frame. A broad, unhurried man with the confidence of someone who had never in his professional life been wrong in front of an audience he could not correct later. Behind him, in the hallway, she could see the shapes of 2 ranch hands who had apparently decided that whatever was happening in this room was worth standing close enough to hear. Mrs. He used her name the way men like him always did, as a small demonstration of control, a reminder of position. "I was told you'd taken it upon yourself to attempt a remedy." "I have," she said. She did not move from the bed. His gaze dropped to the jar on the side table, then to the tin cup still in her husband's hand. Something moved through his expression, amusement shading into performance, the kind a man rehearses when he wants an audience to know exactly how he feels before he says it aloud. "Goat's milk," he said. There was a pause, calculated, theatrical. One of the ranch hands in the hallway made a low sound that might have been a cough or might have been a laugh. "You're giving a man with a fever of this severity goat's milk." "I am," she said. "And you believe that will—" "I believe it already has," she said simply. He drank it. He hasn't pulled away from it. His breathing steadied in the last 2 minutes, if you'd care to count. She held the doctor's gaze without blinking. But please, say what you came to say. He said what he came to say. He said it at length, and he said it with the measured authority of a man who had been trusted in that valley for 20 years and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. He explained in careful clinical syllables that goat's milk, whatever its virtues as a morning beverage, was not medicine. That fever of this severity required quinine, required compresses, required rest and professional management. That a woman making decisions at a sickbed without the proper knowledge was not courage. It was sentiment. And sentiment, in his considered opinion, had cost more lives on the frontier than bad weather. He did not look at her once while he said it. He addressed the room. He addressed the doorway where the ranch hands stood, their hats off, but their faces openly watching. He spoke as though she were a well-meaning piece of furniture he was politely talking around. She let him finish. That was its own kind of power, and she knew it. She had learned it young, that there is nothing a man who expects interruption fears more than a woman who simply waits. She stood beside the bed with her hands loose at her sides, and she waited. And when the silence finally stretched past the point where the doctor expected a protest or a flinch, she turned back to her husband. He was watching her, not the doctor, her. His eyes were clearer than they had been an hour ago. She had not imagined it, had not manufactured it from hope. The gray-white cast of his skin had softened at the edges. He was still weak. He was still burning, but he was present, in a way he had not been when she first walked through that door. And she had learned the difference between a man who was slipping and a man who was holding. She reached for the jar. She refilled the tin cup. "Drink," she said quietly. She did not say it to defy the doctor. She did not say it loudly. She said it because it was what the moment required, and because her husband's hand had already moved toward the cup before the word was even finished. Behind her, the doctor exhaled through his nose, a sound she recognized as a man deciding whether to make something a confrontation or let it become a story he could tell later. He chose the story. He set down his bag, opened it with the deliberate slowness of a man reclaiming the floor, and began laying out his own remedies on the far side of the table. She did not object. She did not need the field to herself. She only needed what was already happening. Her husband, drinking, slowly and steadily, the cup going down by half while the doctor's back was turned. One of the ranch hands in the doorway shifted his weight. She did not look at him, but she heard the silence he made, the held breath kind, and she understood it for what it was. Not mockery anymore, something closer to watching. That evening, the fever did not break, but it softened. There is a difference, and she knew it the way a woman knows the difference between a storm that is past and a storm that has simply moved to the next county. The breaking of a fever announces itself. The sweat, the sudden exhale, the body releasing what it had been gripping. But a softening is quieter. It is the fire deciding to negotiate rather than surrender. His breathing had changed. Not steady, not easy, but no longer that awful shallow panting that had frightened even the doctor into silence around noon. Now it moved with something closer to intention. She sat beside him and listened to it the way you listen to a river you are not sure you can cross. Measuring, patient, not yet trusting. The doctor left before dark. He did not say she was right. He did not say anything about the milk or the goat or the jar that sat half empty on the windowsill catching the last pale light. What he said was that he would return in the morning, and that if the rancher was no worse, they might cautiously consider themselves fortunate. She thanked him with the courtesy that had been bred into her before she ever arrived in this valley, and she meant it sincerely enough, because the man had come, and coming counted for something even when the coming had brought more doubt than medicine. After he rode out, the ranch hand who had been standing in the doorway all afternoon came to the edge of the porch. He did not knock. He stood there with his hat in his hands, turning the brim in slow circles the way men do when they are working up to something they have not rehearsed. She came to the door. He asked, without quite meeting her eyes, whether the rancher had taken any more of it. The milk. She said he had. 2 cups since noon. She watched the man's jaw move once, like he was chewing on something that had no taste yet. He nodded. Then he asked, careful and low, as if the question embarrassed him, whether the goat gave much. She looked at him for a moment, not with triumph. She did not feel triumphant. She felt what she had felt all day, the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been right about something that cost her considerably to be right about. But she answered him plainly. She said the goat gave enough, not more than that. Just enough. He nodded again, turned his hat twice more, and went back toward the bunkhouse. She stood in the doorway until the last strip of orange left the western edge of the sky, and then she went back inside, back to the chair beside the bed, back to the tin cup and the half-empty jar and the sound of her husband's breathing, which was still the only thing in the room that mattered. She refilled the cup. She set it within reach of his hand. He did not wake, but his fingers, resting loose on the blanket, moved once and found the edge of the cup. She was still in the chair when the gray hour came. That particular hour before sunrise, when the world holds its breath, and even the wind forgets itself. The lamp had burned low. She had not refilled it. She had sat in the near dark and listened to his breathing change. Slowly, the way a river changes when the gradient flattens, and the water stops fighting the stones beneath it. He was sleeping differently now. Not the shallow, dragging sleep of a man whose body is failing its own argument. Something quieter. Something with depth to it. She did not trust it yet. She had learned, over the course of this week, not to trust too quickly. Every small improvement had been followed by another hour of doubt, another rise of heat in his skin, another moment where she pressed her fingers to his wrist and felt the pulse flutter like a moth against a window. So she sat. She watched. She let herself believe nothing further than the next breath. But when the light came, he opened his eyes. Not the way he had opened them before. That glassy, half-conscious surfacing that gave her nothing to hold. He opened them the way a man opens his eyes when he has decided to be present. He looked at the ceiling first, then at the window, then finally at her. She did not move. He said her name, just her name. Nothing attached to it. No apology, no question, no performance of gratitude. Simply her name, spoken in the voice of a man who had not used his voice in days and found it strange to feel it working again. She poured the cup. She crossed the room without ceremony, held the cup steady, and he reached for it himself this time. His hand was weak. She kept her fingers near the base in case he faltered. He did not falter. He drank slowly, the way she had taught him without meaning to, and when he finished, he held the cup a moment before returning it. He said it tasted clean. She said yes. He asked how long. She told him. She watched the numbers settle over him, the days lost, the fever's duration, the arithmetic of how close it had been. And she watched his face take the weight of that without breaking. He was not a man who showed weakness easily, and she had known that from the first week of their marriage. But there was something in his expression now that was not quite weakness and not quite pride. It was the look of a man who has been somewhere he did not expect to return from, and who's only now beginning to understand what he came back to. He looked at the jar on the nightstand, the spotted goat's contribution, unheroic in appearance, sitting in the plain morning light. He looked at her. She waited, standing beside the bed with the empty cup in her hands, in the quiet that comes after crisis, when the house has finally stopped bracing itself, and the only question remaining is what gets said first, and by whom. He spoke first. He said he owed her an apology. She had not expected that. She had expected thanks, perhaps, or a question about the ranch, or some practical directive about what needed doing now that he was recovering. He was a man built from directives. But he said apology, and the words sat between them with unusual weight, the way unfamiliar words do when they are spoken by people who do not use them often. She set the cup down on the nightstand beside the jar. He told her that the morning the doctor came, the morning the men had laughed, he had been aware of more than she might have supposed. The fever had been high, but not so high that sound had left him entirely. He had heard the doctor's tone. He had heard the sound that moved through the yard afterward, that low collective amusement that men make when they believe a woman has done something foolish. He had not been able to lift his head. He had not been able to speak, but he had heard. He said he had not stopped her. He said he should have. She looked at him for a long moment, not with softness exactly, and not with coldness either, but with the measured attention of a woman who has learned to listen to what a man says and measure it against what he does not say. He was not a man who apologized as performance. She had come to understand that much about him. When he said a thing plainly, it was because he meant it plainly. She told him that she had not needed him to stop them. He said he knew that now. She said she had known it then. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite relief. Something quieter than both. He looked again at the jar. The morning light had moved across it since she had last checked, and the glass caught a thin line of gold along its curve, unremarkable and clean. She had refilled it that morning before coming in. The goat had been obliging. The goat, she thought privately, had more dignity than the doctor and asked considerably less in return. He asked her where she had learned about it. She told him. A woman she had known before, in a place with fewer resources than people imagined and more practical knowledge than anyone gave credit for. She did not say more than that, and he did not press. He had a rancher's instinct for which questions mattered and which were merely curiosity dressed up as conversation. He filed the answer somewhere useful and left the rest alone. He said he wanted to sit up. She told him not yet. He looked at her with the expression of a man accustomed to being obeyed on his own property. She looked back with the expression of a woman who had kept him alive on it. The contest lasted approximately 3 seconds. He settled back against the pillow. She adjusted the blanket at his shoulder with the efficient care of someone who has earned the right to do so without asking permission. Outside, the ranch was beginning its morning. The morning came in slowly, the way mornings do on a ranch that has been holding its breath for 3 days. Light pressed under the curtain edge. Somewhere beyond the window, Boots crossed the yard with the careful quiet of men who had not yet been told the news but sensed, the way cattle sense a weather change, that something had shifted in the house. She poured water into the basin and washed her hands with the unhurried discipline of someone who had been doing useful things since before the sun thought to rise. He watched her from the bed. He did not watch her the way a man watches a servant, or the way a man watches something that belongs to him. He watched her the way a man watches something he has only recently begun to understand, which is a different thing entirely. She had not slept much. She had not complained of it. When she turned back, she brought the glass jar again, fresh from the morning, the milk still faintly warm, and set it on the table beside him with the same matter-of-fact precision she brought to everything. He reached for it without being told. That small gesture, the reaching without argument, without the particular male ceremony of pretending reluctance, did not escape her notice. She noted it the way she noted everything, quietly, completely, without making a performance of the noticing. He drank half, then paused to rest, which he did not like, but accepted. She sat in the chair near the window. Outside, she could hear the ranch hands beginning their work in full now, no longer muffled. One voice carried higher than the others. One of the younger men, she thought, who had laughed the loudest when the doctor had held the jar up like evidence of foolishness. She recognized the voice not from spite, but from accuracy. She had a good memory for voices that had aimed themselves at her. He said without preliminary that he supposed he owed her an accounting. She asked what kind. He said the kind where a man admits he left certain things unsaid when she arrived, and certain assumptions standing that should have been corrected sooner. She considered the curtain. She considered the light on it. She said that accounting could wait until he was well enough to make it properly, because a half-finished accounting was worse than none at all. He almost smiled. It did not quite arrive, but it was near. He asked if she intended to keep the goat. She told him the goat had earned permanent residence on this property, and she would hear no argument about it. He did not argue. There was a knock at the door. One of the hands, hat in hand, asking in a lowered voice if the rancher had taken anything yet this morning, and whether there was, he paused over it, whether there was any more of what the missus had given him. She looked at the door. She looked at the jar. She said she would see what could be managed. She managed it. By mid-morning, the spotted goat had been milked a second time with more care and ceremony than any animal on that property had ever received, and the jar, clean, full, carried with both hands, made its way to two of the hands who had been on their feet since before dawn. She did not announce it. She did not make them ask twice. She simply left it on the table in the cook's quarters with a cloth over the top and said nothing more about it. Word moved, the way word always moved on a ranch, without being carried by anyone in particular, and yet arriving everywhere at once. By afternoon, the doctor had returned. Not because he was summoned, because he had heard at the general store, and then at the livery, and then from a man who had no business knowing anything, that the rancher was sitting up. that he had taken broth, that his fever had broken cleanly and his hands had stopped their trembling, and his eyes had returned to their usual precise and unsentimental focus. The doctor stood in the bedroom doorway with his bag in his hand, and the expression of a man who had rehearsed something on the road and was now uncertain whether to deliver it. The rancher looked at him from the chair by the window, where he had moved himself without assistance, which had taken longer than he would admit and mattered more than he would say. She stood near the window, not between them, simply near. The doctor said that he was glad to see improvement. He said that constitutions varied. He said that rest and good management of a patient's environment were often underestimated factors in recovery. No one in the room mentioned the jar. The rancher thanked him for his earlier visit and said he believed he was in good hands. He did not look at her when he said it, but the emphasis was precise and deliberate, and the doctor understood it, and she understood it, and neither of them required him to say it differently. After the doctor left, the light in the room settled again into its late afternoon arrangement, gold along the floor, quiet at the edges. He said from the chair that he believed he owed her the remainder of that accounting. She said she was listening. He said that a man who builds something large sometimes mistakes the size of what he has built for the size of what he is, and that arriving at the difference is uncomfortable work, and that he had not yet finished it, but he intended to. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had not come here to diminish anything he had built. She had come, she said, to see if there was room in it for a life that was also hers. He looked at her then, fully, the way a man looks when he has stopped measuring and started seeing. He said he thought there was room. Outside, the spotted goat moved through the yard in her unhurried, self-possessed way, and the West did not remark upon it, because the West had already understood what the men were only now beginning to learn.